Welcome everybody to today's webinar, How to Start Natural Asset Management Planning. We're thrilled to have you all here. My name is Sam Cava, and I'm the manager of the Natural Assets Project at the Greenbelt Foundation. And I'm joined today by very close partners from the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, or TRCA, and Asset Management Ontario, or AIM Ontario, who bring a wealth of expertise to this very important topic. So to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Greenbelt Foundation's work takes place on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Métis peoples. While natural asset management offers an important framework for valuing and protecting natural systems, we recognize it does not fully align with Indigenous worldviews, which deeply honor reciprocal relationships with the land and water. We are committed to learning from and working alongside Indigenous communities to advance shared goals of stewardship and sustainability. At the Greenbelt Foundation, we have a deep commitment to protecting and enhancing natural assets in Southern Ontario. Through our partnership with TRCA and AIM Ontario, we've worked to strengthen climate resiliency across Greenbelt municipalities by integrating natural asset management into municipal planning. Recently, we partnered with a consulting firm named Watson and Associates, who led a natural asset management project, revealing that while municipalities are increasingly aware of natural asset management, most are still in the very early stages of planning or haven't started at all, highlighting the very importance of today's discussion. So over the next hour, we'll explore practical strategies and resources to help you take on those first steps in natural asset management planning. The webinar slides and recording will be shared with you post-webinar, so don't worry if you're not getting down everything on paper. You'll have access to that after the webinar. Next slide, Joanna. So I would like to introduce to you today's speakers. We have Tracy Timmons, Senior Research Scientist, and Joanna Cleese Van Bommel, Research Analyst from TRCA. I would also like to acknowledge the contributions to this presentation from Research Analyst Aideen Akbari to today's presentation as well. And we also have Michelle Saka, Senior Advisor from Asset Management Ontario. With that, I am going to pass it over to Michelle Saka.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. So as Sam mentioned, my name is Michelle Saka. I'm from Asset Management Ontario, and this is our plan for this webinar. I am going to do an introduction to natural assets. I'm also going to introduce asset management planning, and then we'll focus on how to go about undertaking an asset management inventory. What does that look like? Where can you get data? And then we'll cover how to integrate natural assets into asset management plans, even if you are missing information. And at the end, we'll recap and walk through the first actions you could take to get started once you leave this webinar. Next. Okay, so what are natural assets? We're talking about components of the natural heritage system, so forests and wetlands and water features, but also some more manicured things like lawns and gardens. And there is no right or wrong definition. What's important is to be consistent within your own organization. And then I will quickly touch on the term green infrastructure, just because it is in Ontario's provincial planning statement and asset management regulation, which we'll cover later. But green infrastructure, just to be clear, it does include natural assets. It's an umbrella term, but it includes natural assets and also more enhanced and engineered assets like green roofs and permeable pavement. So when you hear the term green infrastructure in the provincial context, they are talking about natural assets as well. Next. What is important to figure out is what natural assets you have within your conservation authority or municipality's jurisdiction. So do you have forests? Do you maintain any grassland? Do you have rivers? Do you have beaches? Do you have street trees? So these are fairly unique assets. Like, are they natural? Are they enhanced? And again, the exact definition isn't critical here, but if you do have them, I would suggest including them in any natural asset management work. And this slide includes some examples. You could also think of other things like your aquifers, or perhaps you have some coastal shorelines or riparian areas around your rivers and creeks. Next. All right, now we're going to go into asset management planning. Asset management is a defined process for managing a collective set of assets that really tries to help decision makers balance three things: the service levels, the costs, and the risk. And the process informs decision making in a way that I think is really effective and different from the status quo for a couple key reasons. It looks at the whole life cycle of the asset, so it requires great infrastructure to start thinking about the whole life cycle and not just their capital costs for their planning. It embeds risk into decision making. And then finally, it really centers services. So it makes us consider, why do we manage, why do we invest in these assets in the first place? And this is for all assets, so roads and pipes. But when we think about natural assets, so for example, a forest, we think about the services they provide. So often recreation or stormwater management or biodiversity, forests provide many, many services. Asset management then often becomes about making the case for regular investments in all assets, because this can reduce costs over the long term and ensure more reliable services. So I find this helpful to think about this in relation to an asset that I have in my life. So my car. My husband and I, we spent a long time deciding on a car to purchase a couple years ago, and we chose a Volvo, and it is a great car, but I feel like it is constantly reminding me to get it serviced and to get the oil changed, and I don't really want to. Um, But I know that the longer we wait, the more the risk of a breakdown increases. And then I also know that spending some money on that oil change now will help avoid major repair bills that would be significantly more expensive down the line. Or even worse, what is most convincing for me, it would actually eventually make my car die sooner. And then I would have to go through the whole process of buying a new car again, which I really, really don't want to do. So we budget and we plan for those oil changes to regularly invest to maintain our asset. And asset management is the same thing. It just helps an organization do that and plan for investments over a much larger scale and over millions of assets. It helps with financial planning and decision making to find that balance between cost and risk and maintaining the services that the community needs from those assets. Next. And as I mentioned, asset management is a fairly prescribed process. So it involves four key stages, starting with your state of infrastructure, then defining levels of service, life cycle management planning, and then finally the fourth stage is your financial strategies. And Tracy will provide more details, in particular focusing on stage one as a starting point for integrating natural assets. Next. So conservation authorities and many municipalities already manage their natural areas through natural heritage planning, watershed planning, conservation areas, parks, restoration projects, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is still useful to adopt an asset management planning approach for these natural assets. And a big piece of it is about aligning green and gray infrastructure in decision making. So aligning your trees with your telephone poles or aligning your forests with your recreation facilities. Communicating about those forests, for example, to decision makers in the same way that they receive information about the gray infrastructure. So this highlights the importance of natural assets for service delivery. It also emphasizes the costs associated with their potential loss or declining condition as equally important to, say, a road. Asset management planning is also a helpful tool because it provides an organized approach for strategic and long-term decision making, which can often be tricky, and it can help staff defend budgets. So senior leadership, they might know that their car should have an oil change, but they are most likely not as experts in all of the assets a municipality has. So this tool helps make a clear case for the need. It presents all assets in a similar framework, which allows them to communicate the benefits of regular investment in a way that is doesn't require that the decision maker be an expert in that asset. And finally, so existing approaches for managing assets also tend to look at them one at a time. So how do we manage this particular forest? And that is really important. Using asset management is really about helping make decisions about the collective group of assets and prioritizing assets and helping make decisions about trade-offs between groups of assets. And these conversations are happening around gray infrastructure, and it's very important and useful to have green infrastructure be in that room for those conversations. Next. I like to think asset management is so useful. It has been legislated by the province since the mid 2010s, and that is through OREG 58817. So this requires asset management planning for all assets, and it explicitly includes green infrastructure assets, which, as we learned, includes natural assets as part of its definition of all municipal infrastructure assets. Now, this regulation doesn't apply to conservation authorities, but they do have their own reg 68621, so CA mandatory programs and services. So this regulation requires CAs to develop an asset management plan for any water control and erosion control infrastructure. So it doesn't in particular mention natural assets, but it does bring conservation authorities like into that asset management conversation and requires them to do it for some of their assets. So speaking of CAs, I did want to take a minute to talk about the role of CAs in natural asset management. So first, some CAs are choosing to integrate natural assets into their own asset management plan. Second, some CAs are supporting their municipalities within their jurisdiction and integrating natural assets into municipal asset management plans. Sometimes this is through service level agreements. Sometimes it's through joining project teams to support the work as a subject matter expert, or potentially as sources of reliable data on the natural environment. And then finally, as we see in this webinar, CAs with expertise in this area also are acting as educators, so sharing what they have learned with others so they can learn from everything that the CAs are doing. Next. All right, let's get into how to do this, and starting with the question of, okay, so what's in scope with a natural asset management plan? And the key thing here is that you should start by looking at the land that you own and or manage. And this means you will need your land ownership boundaries, and Tracy will get into that in a little bit more detail. So the land you own or manage, that seems simple enough, but there are a couple slightly complicating factors. And the first is it is important to acknowledge that natural assets extend onto private property. So they are part of a system where connectivity is really linked to ecosystem health. That said, asset management as a process is really focused on the assets that a municipality or conservation authority directly manage and or own. And that is how and why it is so effective and useful. So this means you should be focusing on the natural assets you manage in your asset management process, but also realize that asset management isn't meant to or going to protect all natural areas in a jurisdiction. So it really, really needs to be coupled with strong planning policies, zoning policies, bylaws. Asset management alone is not going to protect all of our natural areas. Okay? The second, and this is a really fun special Ontario's situation in particular. So for natural assets, owning and managing aren't always the same organization. So there are many cases where conservation authorities own an area, but a municipality manages it, and vice versa. It also happens a bit. What's important in these situations is communication. So talking to each other, because it can be complicated and there isn't only one solution. The key thing is that we want these assets to be captured in someone's plan. We don't want them to be missed just because they're complicated. And the organization spending money and who has the responsibility for maintenance is likely the place it makes the most sense. But it can really depend on the nature of any agreement. And they can also be included into different plans. That's okay too. We don't roll them up. So please don't let this issue bog you down from getting started. Next. Okay. So you have your property boundaries. So then the process becomes identifying what natural assets you have. And I'm going to cover this really quickly at a very high level where Tracy's going to give you some details on how to do this. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do here is identify the natural assets we see. So in this picture, for example, there is a shoreline beach. There's a tree on that street. And there's also what looks like a forest in that back area. And the question is, do any of these assets fall within your municipal or conservation authority property boundaries? Next. Okay, the final thing I'm going to say and leave you with is when you're thinking about your properties, don't forget sites that you own and manage for other purposes. So some of your municipal buildings might have forests around them. This is an example of a wastewater treatment facility. There are patches of grass, there are rows of trees, and there are patches of trees and shrubs, and there is possibly even a forest in the distance there. And these are important natural assets to consider in your natural asset management planning as well when you go about your inventory. Okay, so now it's time to learn more details about how all of this works and how you can go about doing it. And I'm going to hand you over to Tracy from TRCA to do that.
Thank you. All right, Joanna, next. All right, so when developing an asset management plan, the easiest and perhaps the logical place to start is the state of infrastructure. So, in this stage, conservation authorities or municipalities must be able to answer the questions of what assets they own, including the type, quantity, and location, how much they are worth, how old are their assets, if that's relevant, and what is their condition. And all of this rests on having an asset registry or database that allows you to store, manipulate, and update your asset inventory data. Next. So here's an overview of some steps to get you started with an asset inventory if you don't have a large budget or resources available, and it relies on using existing data sets rather than collecting new data. So in step one, it's really important to connect with your GIS team or staff, managers of natural assets or lands, obviously any asset management specialists in the organization, and potentially partners to discuss and agree upon the intent and goals of your asset management planning and then prepare for building the asset inventory. One really important part of this will be identifying what are the natural asset types that you want to start with when you build your asset database. So it's not necessary to build a database of all natural assets that you own the first time. Um, the first time you're adding natural assets to your asset management planning. So asset management planning is typically updated every 5 years or so, and there really is an emphasis on continuous improvement. So as you'll see later, there are ways to leave placeholders for those in the asset management plan and add these in the future. And then I just wanted to emphasize again how important it is to have a GIS technician or analyst or someone with good GIS skills to help you source, evaluate, and prepare your asset database. Then is next The next step is step 2, where you determine how the data should be organized in the asset database and reported on in the State of Infrastructure report. And these are not always exactly the same, but ultimately the database needs to support you reporting that information that you need to report. In step 3, you will determine what are the minimum attributes that your inventory requires. And attributes are information about your assets. So, for example, asset type or asset value. And you will populate that asset data with attribute information in your database. And step 4 involves searching for, reviewing, and selecting the best available data sets to identify and ideally delineate the assets spatially, i.e., map them. And there really is a cyclical kind of feedback between steps 4, 3, and 2. So the data sets that you find will really help to inform how you organize your data and what attribute information you can populate the first time round. And then next step 5 requires you to prepare those data sets, and that includes developing rules on how your assets are going to be represented, stored, and how to deal with assets that have overlapping spatial extents. So generally, but not always, we want them to be non-overlapping. And then step 6 involves actually assigning that attribute information to your assets, including making sure each asset has a unique ID. So next, I'm going to take a look at some of these steps in more detail. Next. So over here we have the asset hierarchy or organizing your data. And this is really one of the earliest steps of state of the infrastructure reporting. And involves identifying what are the service areas and asset categories that you want to report on. So service areas might be parks and recreation or property services or transportation. And underneath it, we have categories of different natural assets, which can be broken down into finer and finer asset types. And then finally, at the lowest level are the components that make up an asset type. And this is often not necessary or considered perhaps this last level, considered more advanced or something to be added in the future. And the structure that you see here is often referred to as an asset hierarchy. Next. So here's an example for a hierarchy for natural assets. At the top we have, for example, parks and recreation. You also want to make sure that you define or describe each asset type really clearly, so it's very clear what type of natural asset occurs at each level. As I mentioned, they're typically non-overlapping, but there are exceptions. For example, water courses that cross other natural asset types, water courses or streams or rivers. And then asset components, as I mentioned, they make up parts of an asset. So, for example, a forest could be broken down into the components of individual trees and shrubs and soil. But typically, this level of detail is not needed for natural assets, except for perhaps those that have a built component. So maybe if there's a stormwater pond, you want to separate out soil and vegetation from inlets and outlets. Next. So step 3 requires deciding on which attributes to include within your asset inventory. So every single asset will have attribute information. And this really depends on a number of factors, including your level of maturity or experience in asset management, the data that's available to you, the utility of recording those attributes, and the resources available for collecting and updating that information every time you update your asset management plan. But at the basic level of maturity, where you might be starting, conservation authorities or municipalities are recommended to record, those attributes that are readily available and which can help you determine asset value. So at a minimum, this would include your asset type and location. And if this is not a precise coordinate or boundary, then this could at least be, say, the property name or address or street segment on which it's found. And if the data is spatial, which often is for natural assets, then you would have dimensions like the length or the area. Other useful attribute information that may be available for some, but definitely not all natural assets are useful life. Now, useful life is the typical or average expected length of time the asset will provide services that we expect. And these are typically relevant for assets such as street trees or restored assets like a newly planted forest. But it's not applicable to assets that have always existed, like a stream or an old forest. So as I mentioned, asset management encourages continuous improvement through each update of your asset management plan. And at each update, you can add additional more detailed attributes such as the age of the asset, if relevant, the asset condition, uh, and costs per unit area to build or replace the asset. And the latter would be useful to calculate an asset value using the replacement cost method as required by the Ontario Regulation 58817. Next. So next I'd like to talk a little bit about steps 4 and 5, which involves identifying suitable existing data sets and preparing those data sets to identify or map your natural assets. And this task, as I said, really generally requires someone with GIS expertise because usually we're going to be working with spatial data. So I'm going to review some sources of data which you can use if you don't have a big budget to go and collect new data. Next slide. So it's really essential for asset managers to have their property boundaries mapped, including the rights of ways for municipalities. So conservation authorities should be able to access this through the Ontario GeoHub for free, along with other nonprofits, and municipalities can get property boundary information through the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. But obviously, first check with your GIS department to see what property boundaries they have. If you only have a list of addresses, I would still recommend getting those original property boundaries. However, if you have expertise on where the boundaries are, you could potentially delineate or digitize them on imagery such as Google Earth. However, just remember that people sometimes are mistaken on the precise location of their property boundaries. I mentioned right of ways because, as we know, um, these are really these are right of ways, so adjacent to our roads. They are natural assets here, like street trees and other natural assets like meadows or wetlands, for example, or little patches of forest. And they shouldn't be forgotten because they provide services, they can cost money to maintain, and of course, they can pose a risk to the public. For example, if a tree falls over into the road. Next. Yeah, so after your property boundaries have been identified, it's then necessary to actually go about identifying or mapping the natural assets that occur within these properties. And the first step is to determine what data your organization already has. So you may not be aware of all the data sets that already exist. So again, connecting with GIS staff is essential, but also your land or asset managers because they may have additional data sets that the GIS team might not be aware of. So at the municipal level, both local and regional municipalities may have data on assets that you own or manage. And it's really valuable even if you're a lower tier to look at what the upper tier municipality might have or vice versa. Um, some types of municipal data sets that are, quite commonly collected are street tree inventories that list the location of a tree and possibly the species and size. There might be natural heritage features included in official plans and data there that could be used for building the asset management plan. Municipalities also sometimes collect aerial photography, which could be used to support like verifying this data or adding natural assets that might have been missed. And this is very true for conservation authorities. And conservation authorities tend to focus on our natural assets like forests, wetlands, and meadows. And they might do this through natural heritage or natural cover mapping. They may also have what are known as ecological land classification maps, and this goes down to very fine level of detail in terms of vegetation types, but it's really only at the highest level that we need this information, which is easy to extract. And so, for example, we might pull out deciduous forests or just forests or wetlands at that highest level. Conservation authorities may also have water courses and water bodies and aerial photography. And then the one thing to note about conservation authority if you're a municipality is that um, conservation authorities will collect their data typically aligned with watershed boundaries, so it may be necessary to put together data from two different conservation authorities to cover a municipality. Next. So if both CAs and municipalities do not have many or any data sets on natural assets, then the Ontario GeoHub is a great place to find data sets, although these all have their limitations, as any data set does. So I'm going to review some data sets in a moment that could be useful for you. And one of the advantage of the provincial data sets over, say, a conservation authority data set from the municipal perspective is that they are organized. They're not organized by watershed boundaries, so you don't have to merge together different data sets. Next. So the first data set I wanted to talk about was forests, or the wooded area layer on Ontario GeoHub, which can be used to populate forest natural assets. This data layer provides information on hedges, treed areas, and plantations. However, like many of the Ontario GeoHub datasets, it is updated. It is updated, but irregularly, and not all at the same time. So the most recent update appears to be from 2018, and there are other areas that are even 10 years older than that. So this particular data set only covers Southern Ontario, but does still go quite far north of Lake Superior. And then in terms of tips for use, always make sure to verify the data for your area. So look at how recent it is for your area, look at the metadata and attribute data. You can overlay it on like an aerial photograph or in Google Earth imagery or on Esri base maps and sort of verify what you see on the imagery versus what's in the data set. And you could even potentially use these images to update the data. Next slide. Next is the wetlands layer on the Ontario GeoHub. And this delineates different types of wetlands like bogs or swamps or marshes. It provides the provincial evaluation status. So has it been evaluated for provincial significance? And then if so, what is its provincial significance and more? But of course, it's not always complete in terms of capturing all wetlands or in terms of evaluation. Many of them have not been evaluated. Um, so it's in terms of use, it's very similar to the other one. It's updated when new information is submitted, and you want to verify it using as much as possible. Another important consideration is that wetlands overlap with water bodies, and the kind of that distinction between a water body and a wetland can be a bit fuzzy. So you kind of want to try to avoid overlap so that the assets are not double counted. And there's really, you just have to decide which layer is going to take precedence in your database. And of course, a GIS person can help you do that. Next slide. All right, next is watercourses, which is the Ontario Hydro Network on the Ontario GeoHub. And this delineates watercourses and includes data on the type, like if it's a stream or a virtue flow or a ditch, its permanency, its stream name if that's available, and more. Again, you just want to verify the data. Next slide. Then we have water bodies, also via the Ontario Hydro Network, which delineates water bodies, identifies different types of water bodies, such as pond, lake, or river, and its permanency. In terms of use, again, as I mentioned before, you want to check for overlap with wetlands to prevent double counting areas within your asset management plan. And also to note that larger watercourses, so where watercourses or rivers are very wide, they are also included as water bodies. So you need to make a decision about whether you want to just represent rivers as a center line or as an area as well. But it is actually really easy just to delete the rivers out of this layer because they are identified as rivers. Next slide. So just to mention some limitations and just some comments about using these data sets. Of course, they're seldom 100% complete. No data set is 100% consistent, accurate, or up to date. And that's true of the provincial data sets or any data set that you have. For the provincial ones, the entire map is not updated at the same time. It may be compiled from different sources, and some of the areas may be old. So you can verify your data, again, as I mentioned, over aerial photograph or satellite imagery, and there are free resources available to do that. It is also potentially possible to combine data sets to fill gaps. So there's also a Canadian National Wetland Inventory, which could be combined with the other provincial wetlands layer and see if there are any additional wetlands that are found through that process. It's possible to digitize or trace wetlands off satellite imagery or aerial photographs to add features that might be missing or adjust existing boundaries. And then ultimately just accept that, your data is never going to be perfect and you can improve upon it in your next update. The other limitation is that there's usually, with these kind of existing spatial data sets, it's seldom any asset condition or risk data needed. And these two attributes are generally more needed for more mature or advanced asset management planning, but they are really important. And to get this data, ideally, some field data would be collected where you actually go and visit your assets. But there are also other options like using remote sensing. So, for example, LiDAR to map erosion along stream banks, or to use aerial photographs to assess the health of the tree canopy. Next slide. Okay, so finally, I just want to touch on beaches and bluffs. So these are not, I guess, they're not extremely widespread. We tend to know where they occur across our water bodies, and they're not available on Ontario GeoHub as far as I know. And you may be able to find these in ecological land classification data set from a conservation authority. However, if not, these assets, as I mentioned, are not usually very many or very extensive. So one could use uh, aerial imagery or Google Earth imagery to actually manually digitize them without adding too much extra time. And also you may have local knowledge about where exactly they exist, or you could overlay water bodies layer on top of an aerial image and then digitize those assets. So not too much extra work to actually add this asset category into your data if you don't already have it. Yeah, and so that brings me to the end of kind of how to get started with your asset inventory. I'll hand it over to Joanna.
Thanks, Tracy. Those resources are very valuable for identifying and inventorying the natural assets you own or manage, but they don't necessarily, as you said, have all the information needed to complete an asset management plan. So I'm going to walk through some options for what to do when you're still missing information. A key tenet of asset management planning is continuous improvement. This means that plans can be published while they're missing information, or if the initial data sources you used were coarser resolution than you'd like. But since these plans are being updated every few years, there's always an opportunity to improve. The in-between stages with missing components can be hard to picture, so we've pulled a few examples of how municipalities and conservation authorities have included natural assets before the full asset management planning process has been completed. Early integration of natural assets into asset management plans usually comprises of commitments and/or placeholders. Commitments can be a simple sentence or a more detailed work plan for how to access, collect, and analyze the data needed to plan for natural assets as a next step in subsequent asset management plans. Placeholders provide a bit more structure within the asset management plan to highlight any work done so far and to allow for easy updates with continuous improvement. The first example here is from TRCA, our conservation authority, and shows two levels of commitments from sequential corporate asset management plans. In 2021, the Asset Management Plan introduction had a list of asset management principles, including to outline opportunities to include green infrastructure in asset management planning in cooperation with municipalities and other TRCA partners. This really set up green infrastructure asset management planning, including natural assets, as a priority for the organization. By 2024, we've expanded to including green infrastructure and other natural assets as a specific item in our next section. We gave a little bit more context and rationale, including the important services provided by natural assets, the potential decreases in capital, operations, and maintenance costs by including them in formal asset management planning, and our role in leading by example. We're now following up on this commitment with at least a subset of natural assets being integrated into the next asset management plan. This is a great first step if your asset management plan is coming out soon, or if you need some more time to build capacity. Another type of commitment is to identify the types of natural assets you may have and to list them specifically for consideration in the future, like the city of Orillia did here. In their plan, they'd already inventoried their trees and forests, but not included any other natural assets. Instead, as a commitment, they listed the other types of natural assets that the city may own or manage for consideration. This didn't require any existing data, they haven't created a hierarchy or begun an inventory, but it can be useful to clearly state the type of assets to consider and have everyone on the same page. Alternatively, instead of outlining specific assets, the focus can also be on the steps needed for improvement. An example here is from the City of Windsor, which identified the tasks, resources required, and responsibilities for improving their natural asset section of the asset management plan. They included tasks such as new mapping, valuation, and even improvements for the existing sections on trees. This is a more stepped approach that can be useful to communicate with the responsible parties and to begin work planning for how to complete the tasks assigned. Moving on to placeholders, there's a few different approaches. This first one is from the City of Ottawa, which outlines all natural assets quite broadly and allowed them to do a basic inventory of the area of each type. They then got more specific for trees and the forestry fleet, which is what the city had more information on. Therefore, they were able to calculate the replacement value you see on the column on the right. But in subsequent sections of the plan on age and condition, they only included the tree and forestry fleet assets. They did acknowledge that although there's various methods available for estimating replacement costs for other green space and forest assets, further review is required before the city includes such estimates in the asset management plan. So in this case, their focus is really on presenting the results thus far, the inventory, and then having that placeholder in that the right column for replacement value where it says not available. Another option is to have placeholders throughout by setting up an entire skeleton of a plan that holds space for future updates. Here, the example is the City of Hamilton, which has a separate natural asset management plan, or NAM, as they have unique asset management plans for each service area. But you could do the same with a single chapter within a more comprehensive asset management plan. While they haven't completed the steps of asset management planning for all natural assets, they have mapped out what they need to do to get there and held space in this document for the state of infrastructure information once it's available. Inside of the plan, they've set up their asset hierarchy, identified the assets that they manage, and calculated the quantity similar to what Ottawa did. A nice addition here is that they've added the data confidence to the table at the bottom to show that there's still room for improvement in the data sets they've developed that inventory based on so far. But beyond that, they haven't completed any other stages of natural asset management. Instead, they've made plans and step placeholders. So for example, they have a section laying out a framework for how to collect inventory data, how to identify services for the levels of service stage, and examples of how condition could be scored, including this table here. That means less work down the line as the foundational decisions have been made, and they can follow that approach once data is available. For replacement costs, they haven't begun calculations or even outlined the methods, but instead they've held a space and included some text about why it's important to do valuation. The proposed benefits that they see are to meet OREG 588.17, but also to showcase the importance of managing these assets for the services they provide and the financial resources that have already gone into them. And then finally, they've set up a timeline and roadmap for how they're going to expand the skeleton to a full asset management plan by 2031, including data collection, risk assessment, levels of service, lifecycle management, and financial planning. Out of all of the commitment and placeholder options we've covered, this approach is the most intensive, but would be a good option for municipalities or conservation authorities that are keen to start but are waiting on data. So to conclude today, we want to highlight some initial actions you can take to begin natural asset management at your municipality or conservation authority. As you're the ones attending this presentation, you may be responsible for pulling together asset management planning and therefore including natural assets at your organization. However, depending on your role and the size of your organization, there could be others with valuable information. Looking back at this example from the City of Windsor's asset management plan, which lists responsible departments for improvement tasks, both forestry and natural areas, as well as asset management planning, are implicated in most rows, but also they bring in GIS and environment and climate change. So depending on your role, you may consider connecting with land managers or other environmental staff to understand what natural assets you have and what data exists for them. You may also loop in GIS staff to support your technical needs, or connect with asset managers and financial officers for guidance on how they work with traditional or gray infrastructure and make sure that it's reported on in the same way to ensure alignment. You may also be working with a consultant, and so pulling together these people and data sources to share with them. Other potential partners are the municipalities and CAs around you, as both Tracy and Michelle have spoken about. So if you're a two-tier municipality, your regional or local counterpart may have relevant data, as may conservation authorities, but they're also experts in natural assets, including understanding their services and risks to their condition, which is needed in the later asset management stages. In some cases, those around you may have specific natural asset management planning expertise, but learning together by working through the stages of planning process is also beneficial. Through these internal and external connections, you may be searching for data or looking at the provincial options that Tracy shared. As a reminder, there's two broad types of data essential for creating a natural asset management plan: those that identify the spatial extent of the lands you own and or manage, and data on the natural assets within those properties. The land ownership and responsibility data will likely have to come from your municipality or conservation authority, or some of the options that Tracy shared. However, for natural assets, the other sources of data, like the provincial data sets, are a really great start. Finally, the 4 stages of asset management planning can be really overwhelming initially, but it's important to remember that this is a long-term planning process and is designed to be continually updated and improved. Our hope today is that you have identified some clear first steps to begin. So it's up to you and your capacity what elements of natural assets are integrated into the next asset management plan for your municipality or conservation authority. As you saw, there's a range of commitments, first steps, and placeholders to choose from. You may start by setting the intention or commitment to learning more in the coming years and integrating in the future. Based on your traditional or gray asset management planning experience, you may be able to outline a plan for how long this process will take you, or you could list the natural assets on the properties you do own or manage. If you have data or find useful data from the other sources, you could start with a hierarchy and an inventory. And with any of these options, you can always include placeholders to mark further commitment and location for continuous improvements. Lastly, we want to share a few other resources you may find helpful. We were part of a project that was funded by the Greenbelt Foundation to provide an overview and guidance for the full natural asset management process called Nature's Infrastructure. It provides greater detail on what we did today and may help address further questions you have. There's even an appendix that we wrote specifically about CAs in Ontario and their role in supporting natural asset management for other conservation authorities and municipalities, with specific examples of projects that we and other CAs have worked on. Next, we're publishing a guide for valuing forest and tree assets early next year to help people understand common approaches and the decision points for selecting which is appropriate for you. Then, IM Ontario hosts an online training course about climate change and green infrastructure, including natural assets, to support municipalities in constructing a framework for implementing an integrated climate change action plan and asset management program. And finally, if you're from a conservation authority, we also want to share that there is a CA Natural Asset Management Working Group that meets to share expertise, host workshops like we recently did at Laternal, develop resources such as the valuation guide, and also a document that we shared a couple of months ago called Examples of Natural Asset Management Language in Conservation Authority Plans and Strategies. We'll be resharing that with those of you on the webinar who have a CA email. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. I believe we have a few minutes for questions, but we'll also be sharing these slides that include our contact information if you think of anything later. And with that, I will pass it back to Sam.
Perfect. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Michelle. At this time, I encourage anybody left on the call to ask any questions you might have in the chat. So you feel free to type in your question in the chat, and Tracy, Michelle, and Joanna would be happy to answer those questions. I'm also going to share a survey link. So this is another opportunity for you post-webinar. If you have any remaining questions you want to ask any of our panelists, you can complete the survey form and ask your questions through that platform as well. But if there's any questions for our panelists, we're happy to answer. Maybe to get things started, I do have a question that came to mind. So if I'm a municipality and I want to take the first step of outreaching to my conservation authority, any insights, any recommendations on what that might look like? That initial email, that initial outreach, or even vice versa. If I'm a conservation authority wanting to outreach to my municipality in my jurisdiction, any recommendations for that kind of initial outreach?
Okay, that's a great question. I think one thing, if you're not sure who to contact, it might be to leverage your existing contacts. So if you're a municipality and you don't know who in the conservation authority is the best person to speak to, I would just reach out to the people that you do know and see if they can put you in touch and say, tell them that this is what you're engaged in is asset management planning and you want to include natural assets in your process. And is there anyone at the Conservation Authority who you could work with? I'm going to cough, so.
Joanna or Michelle have any additional thoughts?
I can hop onto that to say that we have done a little bit of linking with some of the municipalities the Greenbelt Foundation works with. And certainly if you're having trouble tracking someone down, reaching out to the Greenbelt or ourselves, like I said, our contact information is on the slides you'll receive. We would also be happy to help you track someone down.
Perfect. Don't see any questions in the chat. I do have one more question that I thought might be of interest to some folks on the call around GIS expertise. So if it's very obvious that having GIS expertise is important in the initial stages of natural asset management. So I'm wondering, as a municipality, if you might not have a GIS, that might not be the case for majority municipalities, but if you don't have a GIS expert on staff or they lack capacity, any advice on where to contract that out, or like if you don't have that expertise on hand, how would a municipality go about doing that?
Yeah, I would suggest again the potential to work with your conservation authority because there would be typically at least some people on the conservation authority, even if they're small, who would have GIS expertise for working with spatial data. The other option is to hire a consultant, but then again, working with a conservation authority to sort of support you through that process, even if they're new as well, because they have that natural asset expertise that they can bring along and perhaps be an advisor in that process. The other option is to hire maybe a technician for a contract as well to support you in that process. Yeah, I don't know if Michelle from Asset Management Ontario's perspective, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that was a good summary of the options. I think, yeah, there's, smaller municipalities, there's a chance there's one person who does GIS and maybe they don't know the GIS for the environment piece, right? Like they might be roads, or they might just be experts in built infrastructure or GIS for like siting things. There's lots of different GIS specialties, but the skills are transferable. So I think if there's a way to help them find the capacity and to get that group together where there are people who have the environmental expertise and can help guide the GIS work, like I think, it is fairly simple GIS tasks. It's not any detailed like spatial analysis or anything. Like it's really overlaying and clipping and looking at areas of the assets. So I think they could pick it up quite quickly if they were supported in that.
Thanks, Michelle. So we have two actually questions from the folks on call here. So I'm going to first go to Rhonda. So her question is, how do you determine the value of natural assets? So I know Joanna kind of hinted at this valuation document coming out, but I know it's a kind of a broad question to answer in less than a minute, but any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so we can talk briefly about it. It's a great question, obviously a big part of your inventory. And the short answer is you use an approach, the same approach that Gray Infrastructure uses, looking at current replacement value of the asset. So you're not trying to do an ecosystem service valuation of all the services. You're looking at how much would it cost to replant that forest. But then the thing that is special and unique about natural assets is we want to find a way to account for the time it would take for that forest to mature. So that's where it doesn't align with Gray Infrastructure. And Joanna mentioned a report that's coming out early in the new year. That's a step-by-step guide on how to do that, like different methods for accounting for that time in your asset to calculate current replacement value to align with Gray Infrastructure assets.
Great. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Natalie, I see your hand is up. I'm going to try the allow you to talk and see if that works. Natalie, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask the question, or you can ask it in the chat. We can't hear you, Natalie, if you're speaking. You can try typing in the Q&A or in the chat, if that's helpful. If not, we only have a minute left, but Natalie, like I said, feel free if you have an outstanding question, you can use the survey link to ask the question there, or directly contact any of our panelists on the screen with the email that we'll provide in the slide deck that we'll share with you in a matter of a few days. So just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, for taking your lunch to join us. We really appreciate it. Hopefully you got some really good nuggets out of this. I hope you did. Like we said, we're going to be sharing the webinar recording and slides with you in the next few days, so please look out for that. But with that, I wish you guys all a great rest of your day and hope to hear from you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.